Valentine's Day, a day filled with love, romance, and heart-shaped everything. But beneath the surface of red roses and chocolates, there lies a darker, more sinister truth. For some, February 14th is not a celebration of affection, but a reminder of terror. From eerie encounters with the supernatural to love gone horribly wrong, these are the stories that will forever change how you see the day of love. Are you ready to hear the 10 real-life Valentine's Day horror tales that will haunt you long after the roses have wilted? It was a cold February night in 2011 when Emily, a young woman in her mid-20s, found herself sitting alone in her small, dimly lit apartment. The snowstorm outside rattled the windows, and the flickering light from her fireplace cast eerie shadows across the room. It was Valentine's Day, but Emily wasn't celebrating. The man she had loved for the past 2 years, Mark, had broken up with her just a week before. The heartbreak was still fresh, and the ache in her chest felt like a cruel reminder of how love could easily slip through your fingers. As she sat, lost in her thoughts, a knock on her door startled her. Emily wasn't expecting anyone, least of all Mark. She slowly rose from the couch and moved toward the door, a twinge of hope in her heart. Maybe he had come to apologize. Maybe he had realized that she was the one. She peered through the peephole and saw no one standing outside. Puzzled, she opened the door. There, lying on the doorstep, was a small, neatly wrapped box. It had a red ribbon tied around it, and a single card was attached with her name written in elegant script. Her heart raced as she knelt down and picked up the box. It was strange. There was no return address, no indication of who had left it. For a moment, she wondered if maybe it was from a friend, someone trying to cheer her up. She carefully opened the box, her breath catching in her throat when she saw what was inside. A delicate silver necklace lay nestled in a bed of velvet, the pendant shaped like a heart. But it wasn't just any necklace. It was the same one Mark had given her on their first anniversary. The very one she had lost a few months ago, the one she had been so devastated about. How could it be here, on her doorstep, now? Her fingers trembled as she picked up the necklace, and for a moment, she felt a connection to Mark again. Could it be possible that he had somehow found it, after all this time? The hope began to stir once more, but as she gazed at the pendant, something caught her eye. At the very edge of the heart-shaped charm, there was something dark. She tilted it slightly, her stomach turning as she realized the dark stain was blood. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Her mind raced, but her body was paralyzed with fear. She stood there, staring at the necklace in her hand, before the darkness in the apartment seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive. Suddenly, there was a loud crash behind her. Emily spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. But no one was there. The apartment door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the windows rattling as if a gust of wind had blown through. But Emily hadn't heard any wind. The temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and her breath fogged up in front of her as if she had stepped into a freezer. The sound of soft footsteps echoed down the hall, slow and deliberate. She backed away from the door, her pulse racing. Her eyes were wide with terror. There was no way Mark could have made it back here. He had been gone for a week, and they hadn't spoken since their breakup. The only thing she could hear now was the footsteps, growing louder, closer. She looked down at the necklace once more. This time, she noticed something even more disturbing. A date engraved on the back. February 14th, 2011. Her breath hitched as she whispered to herself, "How did you know I'd be here?" And then, just as suddenly as the sound of footsteps had started, they stopped. Emily's heart hammered in her chest. She wasn't alone. But who or what was standing in the hallway? The door to her apartment creaked open. She didn't even dare to look, too terrified to move. But from the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow pass beneath the doorframe. The shadow paused. In a barely audible whisper, the voice came. "Love never dies." The voice was unmistakable, soft, yet full of malice. It was Mark's voice. But Mark wasn't supposed to be there. He couldn't be. A chill ran down Emily's spine as the shadow outside the door grew darker, its form twisting and contorting into something unnatural. With a sudden rush of adrenaline, Emily dropped the necklace and ran, her heart pounding as the darkness chased after her. She didn't know what had happened that night, or what had been waiting for her in the hallway. But one thing was certain. Love, in whatever form it took, had come back to haunt her, and it was far from over. The phone call came late on the night of February 14th, 2003, just as Sarah was settling in to relax after a quiet evening at home. She had always found solace in being alone on Valentine's Day. After a tumultuous breakup, she wasn't ready to face the world, especially not the world of love and romance. But as the phone rang, she answered it without hesitation. "Hello." A man's voice came through the line, a voice she didn't recognize. "You don't know me, but I've been watching you for a while. I've seen how beautiful you are, how kind, and I wanted to give you a gift." Sarah felt her skin crawl. This was not what she expected from a phone call at that hour. "Who is this?" she demanded, her heart beating faster. "Don't worry, my love. I've already left you something. You'll find it soon." Before Sarah could respond, the line went dead. She stared at the phone, feeling uneasy. What could this mean? Was it some sick prank? She shook her head, trying to push the feeling of dread away. But when she stood up to turn off the lights and head to bed, she noticed something on her doorstep. A bouquet of deep red roses, freshly cut, their petals glistening in the dim light. The roses weren't just any ordinary bouquet. Each one was tied with a thin black ribbon, and at the center of the flowers, there was a small card with a single line written in neat handwriting. "You will never be alone again." Sarah's stomach turned. She picked up the bouquet cautiously, her mind racing as she glanced around. But the street outside was eerily quiet. No one was there. She brought the flowers inside, feeling like she had just brought something sinister into her home. With trembling hands, she set them down on the kitchen counter and inspected the card again. Who could have left this? The word seemed almost too personal, too intimate. As she stared at the bouquet, Sarah's phone buzzed again, the message lighting up the screen. It was a picture of the exact roses she had just picked up, and beneath the image, the words, "You'll be mine soon." Fear gripped her chest, and she quickly scanned the room. Her heart pounded in her ears, her mind racing to understand what was happening. Had she been stalked all this time? Who was the man behind the voice on the phone? And why was he sending these roses? The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening. Suddenly, she heard the distinct sound of footsteps outside her window. Someone was watching her, and this time, they were too close to ignore. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was lurking just outside her window. The footsteps had stopped, but her heart still hammered in her chest, erratic and desperate for escape. She stood frozen for a moment, eyes darting nervously across her dimly lit living room. The sound of her breathing filled her ears as she slowly made her way toward the window, inching closer with each hesitant step. She couldn't see anyone, not a single figure or shadow cast on the snow-covered ground outside. Her neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. Her mind was clouded with a mix of paranoia and confusion. Was she overreacting? Had she simply imagined the footsteps? It was late, after all. Maybe it was just the wind or the distant sound of someone shuffling about in their own home. But as Sarah peered out through the sheer curtains, the world outside seemed unnaturally still. The streetlights flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the barren sidewalks. She squinted, eyes adjusting to the night, when something on the ground caught her attention. There, in the snow near her driveway, was a single red rose. It wasn't the bouquet from earlier. This rose stood alone, its stem dark with frost, its petals curled inward as if waiting to be discovered. But what sent a cold shiver down Sarah's spine was the undeniable feeling that this wasn't just a rose. It was a message. She took a step back from the window, swallowing hard as a sudden chill ran down her spine. Her phone buzzed again, a sudden jolt in the heavy silence. She grabbed it from the counter, her fingers trembling as she unlocked the screen. It was a text message from an unknown number. "I told you, Sarah. You'll never be alone again. I'm right outside, and I'm coming in." Her stomach twisted, and her breath caught in her throat. The message sent an icy wave of dread over her, suffocating the air in her apartment. She didn't waste another second. She grabbed her coat, her shoes, anything she could carry, and rushed to the front door. Her heart pounded like a drumbeat as she hesitated, her hand resting on the doorknob. She had to leave. She couldn't stay here any longer, not with someone or something out there. She wasn't going to wait for them to make their move. But then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze. Her mind screamed at her to leave, but her body betrayed her, keeping her rooted to the spot. The knock came again, louder this time. She backed away slowly, her breathing shallow. She thought she saw movement from the corner of her eye, someone standing just outside the door, just beyond the crack in the hallway. Her pulse raced, the seconds stretching like an eternity. Another knock. This time, it sounded different. It wasn't a simple knock. It was deliberate, urgent. There was something almost rhythmic about it, like someone was trying to communicate through the door, desperate to be heard. Sarah couldn't bear it any longer. She bolted to the window, throwing open the blinds, her eyes scanning the darkened street. Nothing. No one was there. Suddenly, the phone buzzed again. Her eyes widened as she read the new message. "Look behind you." Her blood ran cold. Without thinking, she spun around. Standing directly in the doorway of the kitchen was a man. He was tall, his features obscured by the shadows, but there was something undeniably familiar about him. His posture was rigid, his hands clasped behind his back, and his presence felt suffocating, as if the very air had thickened in his wake. He didn't move. He just stared at her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The man was wearing a black suit, and in his hand was another bouquet of roses, this time blood red with black ribbons trailing from their stems. But these weren't just any roses. No, these were far more disturbing. They looked wrong. The petals were dark, like they'd been burned at the edges. Some of them were crinkled and shriveled, their colors bleeding into unnatural shades. And in the center of the bouquet, wrapped around the stems, were strands of thick, dark hair. The man didn't speak. His eyes were fixed on hers, unmoving, unblinking, as though he was waiting for something. Or maybe watching her, waiting for her to do something. Sarah stumbled backward, her body trembling with a primal fear she couldn't control. Her mind screamed to run, to escape, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. Every instinct told her to scream, to cry for help, but her throat was dry, the words trapped inside her chest. The man stepped forward, his slow, measured movements echoing in the silence. The roses he held seemed to grow heavier with each step, as though they carried the weight of something far more sinister than mere flowers. And then, just as he reached the threshold of the room, he smiled. It was a smile that chilled her to the bone. Not a smile of warmth or affection, not a smile of love, but a twisted, knowing grin. His teeth were unnaturally sharp, too white in the dim light, and his eyes, those eyes were cold, devoid of any humanity. They were hollow, almost empty, like he wasn't even really there. "Sarah," he whispered softly, his voice dripping with dark affection. "I've been waiting for you." Sarah couldn't move. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The man's voice echoed in her ears, and the sound of his slow breathing was the only thing she could hear in the oppressive silence. Her thoughts were scrambled, 1,000 possibilities racing through her mind, but none of them made sense. Who was this man? Why was he here? And why was he so fixated on her? But just as quickly as the terror had gripped her, an instinct kicked in. She wasn't going to just stand there and wait for whatever nightmare this was to unfold. Without a second thought, She bolted for the kitchen, heart hammering in her chest as she scrambled for the nearest exit. But before she could reach the back door, she felt a sharp pain in her arm. It was as if someone had grabbed her, yanked her back with inhuman strength. She stumbled, crashing into the kitchen table as her legs gave out beneath her. And there, standing just inches from her, was the man. His hand gripped her arm tightly, his fingers digging into her flesh. She could feel his cold breath on her skin, his presence so overwhelming that it suffocated her every breath. "You won't be leaving, Sarah," he whispered, his voice low and menacing. "Not tonight." She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened almost painfully. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment Sarah saw something terrible in those eyes. It was as if he was looking deep into her soul, as if he knew her every secret, every fear. And then, with one swift motion, he shoved her back toward the table. The roses fell to the floor, their petals scattering like a crimson waterfall. But it wasn't the flowers that caught her attention. It was a reflection in the window behind her. For a split second, she thought she saw a figure, a shadow, moving just beyond the glass. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was a woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror, her body twisted and contorted in ways that made Sarah's stomach churn. She was trying to scream, her mouth open in a silent, desperate plea for help. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the reflection was gone. Sarah spun around, but the man was already gone. The kitchen was empty, save for the mess he had left behind. The roses, the strange figure, the whispers. Everything felt like a twisted nightmare. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. And as Sarah collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, one thought raced through her mind. Sarah's mind raced as she sat on the cold kitchen floor, staring at the roses scattered around her, the shadow she had seen in the window, the twisted figure that seemed to scream without sound, was haunting her thoughts. Was it real, or had she imagined it? Her breath came in shallow gasps, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, making it hard to think clearly. The man, the one who had entered her home with the roses, had vanished just as quickly as he had appeared, leaving behind a sense of dread so thick it was almost suffocating. She couldn't stay here. Not anymore. But the thought of leaving made her feel trapped. The moment she opened that door, would he be waiting? Had he followed her? Or worse, was he already inside her mind, controlling every step she took? Sarah knew she had to leave, but fear gripped her every action. It wasn't until she finally managed to gather enough courage to stand that she saw something that made her freeze in place. It was a faint, almost imperceptible scratch on the wall just beside her. The walls, which had been pristine before, were now marred with dark, jagged lines that looked almost purposeful. She moved closer, her hand trembling as she traced one of the lines. It didn't feel like a normal mark. It felt almost like it had been carved into the wall by something sharp, something deliberate. Her heart pounded in her chest as she followed the lines. They led to a spot just behind her kitchen sink, where a small cabinet door had been slightly jarred open. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it was impossible to ignore. Something was inside. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to open the cabinet, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. She reached for the door, her fingers shaking, and with a quick jerk, she flung it open. Inside the cabinet was a small, ornate box. Its surface was smooth and polished, gleaming in the dim light of the room. It looked old, almost ancient, and it seemed to shimmer with an energy she couldn't place. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to it, compelled by some unseen force to open it. She took a step back, hesitating for a moment, her heartbeat a loud drum in her ears. What could be inside? What did it mean? But then, as if she had no other choice, her hands moved on their own, gently lifting the lid. Inside the box were more roses. No, not just roses. Each one was delicately arranged in a circle, almost as if they were meant to form a sacred, unholy symbol. But these roses weren't like the ones she had seen before. Their petals were withered and torn, their color faded to an almost sickly shade of brown. And in the center of the circle was something that made her stomach turn, a single photograph, yellowed and curling at the edges. She picked it up, her eyes scanning the faded image. The photograph was black and white, but she could still make out the faces of two people standing in front of an old house. One was a man, tall, dark-haired, with a piercing gaze that sent a chill down her spine. And the other was her. It was unmistakably her face, though the woman in the photo looked much younger, almost childlike. Sarah's hands shook as she dropped the photo back into the box. She didn't understand. How could this be? Why was she in this photograph, standing with a man she had never seen before? The answer came to her with a jolt, a memory long buried, one she had tried to forget for years. The dream. When she was a child, Sarah had often had dreams of a man watching her, of roses, and of a house far away from where she lived. The man in those dreams had always been the same, tall, dark-haired, his smile always twisted and cruel. And the house? It had never been a place she'd been to. But now, looking at the photograph, it was like a piece of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed had clicked into place. This man, the one from her dreams, the one she had pushed away in the recesses of her mind, was real. And now he was here. The realization hit her like a wave, crashing over her with such intensity that she staggered backward, knocking over the small table beside her. She gripped the edge of the sink to steady herself, but it did little to calm the rising panic in her chest. There was something darker at play here, something far more sinister than a simple stalker. This man wasn't just obsessed with her. He was tied to her past, tied to something that had happened when she was too young to understand. And that was when she heard the knock again. The sound wasn't coming from the front door this time. It came from somewhere deeper in the apartment. She turned slowly, her body frozen in place, as the noise repeated itself, slow, deliberate, unnerving. Someone was inside. Panic surged through her, making her head spin. She backed away from the cabinet, her mind racing to process everything. The photograph, the roses, the man. Everything was connected, but how? What did he want? What had she missed? She couldn't think straight, couldn't see the path out. The knocking continued, now joined by a soft scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. It came from the hallway, from the direction of her bedroom. A cold sweat broke out on Sarah's skin as she realized the door to her bedroom was slightly ajar. Slowly, cautiously, she moved toward it, holding her breath. The hallway stretched before her like a dark, yawning mouth, and as she approached the door, the scraping grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to get out. She pushed the door open, her pulse pounding in her ears. Inside, there was nothing, at least, nothing she could see. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and dust. But as she stepped inside, a light flickered in the corner of her eye. She turned her head sharply to the source of the movement, and there it was, a shadow. But this wasn't a shadow in the traditional sense. It wasn't a simple shape cast by the flickering light. No, this shadow seemed to have a life of its own. It moved, swaying as if it were alive, creeping along the floor in unnatural ways. And then, as if it sensed her gaze, it stopped, its edges rippling like smoke. Her breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, her mind screaming to run, but she couldn't. Her legs felt like lead, her body paralyzed with fear. And then the voice came, not from the shadow, not from the room, but from the very walls around her. "Sarah, you'll never escape." The whisper was low and rasping, like someone or something was speaking from the depths of the earth itself. It reverberated through her skull, rattling her bones. The shadow grew larger, more solid, as it crept toward her, slithering like a living thing. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing inward. Then, in the same breath, everything went silent. Sarah didn't know if she could hear her own thoughts anymore, if her mind was even functioning. She felt herself fading, losing control of her body. Her hands reached out to the wall for support, but the surface felt cold and wet, as if she had plunged her fingers into something far worse than anything she could have imagined. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the smile. That same twisted grin, now forming on the shadow's face, and the echoing words that repeated in her mind. "You'll never be alone again." When Sarah's eyes fluttered open, she was no longer in her bedroom. The familiar surroundings of her apartment had vanished, replaced by an unfamiliar, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, faded and stained with age, and the air smelled of mildew, dust, and something else, something metallic. Her pulse quickened as her senses returned to her. She was lying on a cold, hard surface, the weight of her body pressing into a thin, uncomfortable mattress. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt weak, as though something had drained her of energy. A groan escaped her lips as she fought to steady herself. It was then that she realized she wasn't alone. Across the room, standing just inside a dim doorway, was a silhouette. She couldn't see its features at first, but she knew it was him. The man. The one who had been haunting her thoughts and dreams. The one who had come into her life like a storm. He was watching her, standing perfectly still, his posture rigid and unnaturally composed. There was no malice in his gaze, only an unsettling calm, as if he were waiting for something, as if he had all the time in the world. For a long moment, Sarah couldn't speak. She was too afraid, too stunned by the sheer impossibility of it all. Where was she? How had she gotten here? Had everything that had happened in the last few hours been a hallucination, a fevered dream? But as the man stepped into the light, her heart dropped. His face was unmistakable. The same dark eyes, the same sharp features, the same smile that made her skin crawl. "Sarah," his voice was a low whisper, barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "You've finally come home." Her heart stopped. Home! The word hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken meaning that she couldn't grasp. She tried to speak, to demand answers, but the words stuck in her throat, suffocated by fear. She had to get out of here. She had to leave before it was too late. But as she scrambled to stand, her body betraying her, she felt a sharp tug at her wrist. Looking down, she saw thick, rusted chains binding her to the bed. Panic surged through her as she tugged desperately at them, but they didn't budge. "Don't fight it, Sarah." The man's voice was steady, cold. He took a step closer, and she recoiled instinctively. "I'm not going to hurt you. Not unless you force me to. What do you want from me?" She managed to croak, her voice trembling. He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "What do I want?" he repeated, almost amused. "I've waited a long time for this moment, Sarah. A very long time." The man stepped closer, his black suit rustling with every movement. He stopped just at the foot of the bed, his face inches from hers. Sarah could feel his breath on her skin, cold and suffocating. "You're not safe, Sarah," he continued, his voice soft, almost tender. "You never have been." Her mind raced, but nothing made sense. What was he talking about? Why was he here? Why had he followed her for so long? "Who are you?" she whispered, the words coming out barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" For a moment, there was silence. Then the man's lips curled into a wicked smile. "I'm someone you should have remembered long ago. I'm someone you've been running from for years. Someone you thought you could escape, but you were wrong. We are bound, Sarah. You and I. Our fates are tied together, whether you like it or not." As he spoke, memories, fragmented and blurry, began to surface in her mind. Vivid images flashed before her eyes. A house she didn't recognize, a dark figure standing in the corner of her room, a sense of overwhelming dread. There was something about the man that was familiar, something she had buried deep within her mind. But the more she tried to grasp the memories, the more they slipped through her fingers like sand. It was as if someone, or something, was keeping her from remembering. The man seemed to sense her confusion. He crouched down in front of her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Let me help you, Sarah. Let me remind you of who you really are." He placed his hand gently on her cheek, his touch cold as ice. "You've forgotten everything, haven't you? You've forgotten what you are, what you've done. But I'm here to help you remember." A flash of images burst into her mind, each one more disturbing than the last. A woman, older than Sarah but familiar, standing at the edge of a cliff, her face twisted in terror. A child, crying in the darkness, reaching for her mother's hand. A promise, a deal made in desperation. And then, the most terrifying image of all, herself, a younger version of her, standing in that very same room with the man, her eyes empty, as if she were a mere shell of the person she had become. Her breath caught in her throat as the pieces began to fall into place. She wasn't just running from him. She had known him. She had been with him before. This man wasn't a stranger. He was someone who had once been part of her life, a dark, twisted part of her past that she had tried to forget. But the memories she was now unlocking were far more horrifying than anything she could have imagined. "Do you remember now, Sarah?" The man's voice was low, coaxing, like a whisper in the dark. "Do you remember what we had? What we promised each other?" Sarah's head spun as the memories overwhelmed her. She could see the woman, the child, and herself, so innocent, so naive, standing at the crossroads of a decision that had torn her life apart. She had made a pact, a deal with him, with whatever dark force he represented. It had seemed harmless back then, a promise made in a moment of fear. She had done it to save someone she loved, someone who, like her, had been drawn into this nightmare. But the cost had been too high. She had promised to return, to stay, to never leave him. And now, she was paying the price. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking with the realization. "No, I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it." The man's smile grew wider, more cruel. "You never meant it, but it doesn't matter. You belong to me, Sarah. Your soul was promised long ago." Her body trembled as the truth settled in like a cold weight. She wasn't just a victim. She was part of the very darkness she had tried to escape. And now it had come for her, as it always would. "Don't fight it," the man murmured, his face hovering close to hers. "You can't escape me. You never could." Sarah's heart pounded, panic rising inside her chest like a wave threatening to consume her. She couldn't let this be the end. She couldn't allow herself to fall back into the clutches of the nightmare she had once fled. With everything she had left, Sarah wrenched her wrist free from the chains, her skin raw from the friction. She pushed the man away, gasping for air, her vision spinning. "I won't go back," she cried, her voice raw with desperation. But the man's eyes darkened, and his smile twisted into something darker. "You don't have a choice." The room, once filled with the heavy scent of mildew and rust, seemed to close in around Sarah. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale a struggle against the crushing weight of her situation. The man, the dark figure who had haunted her dreams for years, stood before her, an inescapable presence that made the air feel thick with menace. "I won't go back," Sarah repeated, her voice hoarse but filled with an ember of defiance. She was trembling, but she refused to let him see her fear, at least not all of it. The man's smile widened, stretching unnaturally across his face. There was no warmth in it, no trace of humanity. It was a smile built for torment, for breaking spirits. "You're so naive, Sarah," he said, his voice smooth like the hiss of a serpent. "You've always been this way, running, hiding, thinking you can outrun what you've done. But you can't. You're mine now. Your soul is mine." Sarah's heart raced, her pulse thundering in her ears. She couldn't let him win. Not now. Not after everything she had gone through. The fear still gripped her, deep and cold, but a spark of anger flared inside her chest. "You've been waiting for this moment, haven't you?" she spat, trying to steady her voice, trying to push back the overwhelming dread. You've always known I would come back. You've planned this, all of it." The man nodded slowly, his eyes gleaming with something ancient, something beyond her understanding. "I've waited a long time, Sarah. A very long time. The moment you left, I knew you would return. You can't escape fate. Not when it's written in your blood." Her thoughts whirled. Her past, the memories she had so desperately tried to bury, came rushing back in flashes, each one more vivid and horrifying than the last. She had made a pact she had forgotten about, but it had never forgotten her. She had promised herself to him, to whatever dark force he represented, and now that promise was coming due. But she couldn't accept that. Not after everything. She wasn't going to let her life be defined by some twisted bargain she had made when she was too young to understand its cost. "Get away from me," Sarah said, her voice firm now, despite the terror clawing at her insides. She pushed against the bed, scrambling to get to her feet, but her legs were weak, her muscles stiff from the chains that still held her to the mattress. He watched her struggle, his smile never faltering. "You think you can fight this, don't you? You think you can change your fate. But you can't. I'm inside your head, Sarah. I've always been inside." His words twisted in her mind, but Sarah fought against them, pulling against the chains that still bound her. They dug into her skin, but she ignored the pain. She couldn't afford to feel pain right now. Suddenly, the chains went slack. Sarah froze, her eyes wide. "What?" Before she could react, the man reached out, his hand closing around her wrist with unnatural strength, his cold fingers like iron clamps. He jerked her toward him, lifting her off the bed with ease. "You can't escape me. You never could," he whispered, his voice like the rasp of 1,000 dead leaves blowing in the wind. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but her mind was working faster than her fear. She couldn't let him take her again. She couldn't let him win. And then a thought struck her. The box, the roses, the symbols. Everything clicked. The pact wasn't just a binding of souls. It was a binding of will. A deal made in blood and promises, yes, but there was more. She had given him control over her for so long, but now she had the chance to break free. Her hand shot up, the pain in her wrist forgotten, and she grabbed for the one thing she still had control over, the chain of roses that had once been her curse. She had thought them a symbol of his power, but now she knew the truth. They were the key. She tore the roses from the cabinet in a desperate frenzy, holding them in her hands like weapons. They felt different now, lighter somehow, as though the dark weight that had once filled them had started to fade. She pressed them to her chest, closing her eyes, focusing on the energy they held. The man watched her with growing confusion, his grip tightening on her wrist as he tried to pull her closer. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "You cannot break what was never meant to be broken." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She focused only on the roses, the connection between her and the dark force that had bound them together. The binding was strong but not unbreakable. She had always had a choice. "I'm breaking the chains," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling, but with a fierce resolve. "I'm breaking free." A light flickered inside her, an energy she had long forgotten, buried beneath years of fear and denial. The roses in her hands began to glow faintly, their petals no longer dull and lifeless, but radiant, glowing with an inner power. The man's expression faltered as he felt the shift, his cold grip loosening. The room seemed to hum with an electric charge, the walls vibrating with the power Sarah had unlocked. Her wrist burned as she twisted in his grip, the roses now fully alive in her hands, pushing back against his force. "No!" the man growled, fury and disbelief in his voice. "You can't." But it was too late. The moment Sarah's palm pressed the glowing roses against his chest, a surge of energy blasted through her, sending a shockwave that threw the man backward. His body convulsed in the air as the power of the pact, of everything he had controlled for so long, began to unravel. The light from the roses grew brighter, blinding in its intensity. Sarah clutched them tighter, focusing all her will on breaking the chains, both physical and metaphysical, that had held her captive for so long. The man screamed, the sound a horrible, guttural shriek that echoed through the room, shaking the very foundations of the building. But the more he struggled, the more the light consumed him, until there was nothing left but darkness. And then, with a final, echoing scream, he was gone. Sarah collapsed to the floor, the roses falling from her hands as the last remnants of the light faded. The room was eerily silent, the air thick with the smell of burnt wood and something acrid. Her body was exhausted, her mind racing to process everything that had just happened. But it was over. It had to be. She had broken free. But as she sat there on the cold floor, her thoughts began to shift. What would she do now? How could she live with the memories of everything that had happened? The room around her was still dark, but it didn't feel as oppressive anymore. The weight, the presence that had loomed over her, was gone. She was free, but freedom felt empty, like something important had been lost. In the end, she had won, but at what cost? Sarah stood, the room steadying around her, and with one last look at the place that had held her captive, she turned toward the door. She didn't know what awaited her on the other side. She didn't know if the past would ever truly let her go. But for the first time in years, she felt the possibility of peace. And that, in itself, was enough. Sarah's journey culminates in her ultimate struggle to break the chains that bound her to the past. The confrontation with the man, the revelation of the true nature of their connection, and the final act of defiance all combine to create a tense and thrilling climax. The story ends with Sarah's escape, but the lingering questions about the consequences of her pact leave the audience questioning whether her freedom is truly permanent, or if something darker still lies ahead.